In November 2009, 5 young women, skeletal on the brink of death, were discovered in a hidden basement beneath a house in Ashland, Pennsylvania. Their condition was beyond comprehension. Skin stretched over bones, eyes hollowed by months of terror and suffering. What they had endured was not mere horror. It was the work of a monster no one had seen coming. Jacob R. Miller was more than just a sadist. He was an architect of evil, a neo-Nazi leader whose obsession with so-called racial purity had driven him to construct his own personal hell, underground, inescapable, and unfathomable. He did not simply preach hate. He embodied it in every act, every ritual, every muffled scream behind the locked door of his dungeon. The nightmare began in June 2008 when 19-year-old college student Samantha Baker vanished without a trace on her way home from a late shift at a local restaurant. She was the first. Over the next year, 4 more young women suffered the same fate. No witnesses, no clues, only silence. To the residents of Ashland, Jacob was an unremarkable man. His home at the end of Maplewood Avenue was pristine, its white picket fence freshly painted, its shutters always in perfect condition. He greeted his neighbors with a smile, handed out candy to children on Halloween, bowed his head reverently at Sunday Mass. His small print shop on Main Street was known for its reliability. But behind this carefully constructed facade, his machines churned out something far more sinister. Pamphlets laced with hate, the doctrine of a movement he ruled with an iron grip. Yet his true work was not in the print shop. It took shape in the suffocating darkness of his basement, brick by brick, scream by scream. The dungeon where he kept his victims was more than a prison. It was a tomb for the living, a cramped, airless space where dampness gnawed at the skin and hunger twisted the gut. There, chained, stripped of identity and humanity, they were no longer people. They were objects existing only under his control. He decided when they ate, when they slept, when they suffered. His goal, to breed a new bloodline, a generation molded to his perverse ideals. The torture lasted for months. They were deprived of everything: dignity, identity, a future, but not their rage. On September 3, 2009, Lily Harper bled to death on the freezing floor of the basement while giving birth. Jacob watched in silence, making no effort to save her. Her body, barely covered by a thin cloth, was left to rot in front of the others, a decaying reminder of their own fate. That was the breaking point. They would not live like this. They would not die like this. They waited. On November 10, 2009, the opportunity came. Jacob stumbled into the basement, his breath reeking of alcohol, his step less steady than usual. He believed himself untouchable. He believed he was in control. He did not see the shard of metal Samantha had been hiding for weeks beneath her makeshift mattress. When he leaned toward her, she struck. The first blow wasn't fatal, but the second brought him to his knees. The others lunged at him, driven by fury forged in 1,000 tortures. He didn't have time to scream. He didn't even understand how everything crumbled in an instant. Barefoot, dressed in rags, their faces etched with months of suffering, they tore themselves from that house and ran, sprinting through the freezing night until a passing car finally stopped. When the police entered Jacob's home, they uncovered the full scale of the nightmare. The dungeon, the rusted chains, the walls scratched raw by desperate fingernails. A locked chest containing journals where he had documented his atrocities with chilling precision. Jacob R. Miller survived the attack, but everything he had built was reduced to ashes. Tried in 2012, he was sentenced to life without parole. He died alone in prison, strangled by an inmate who had not forgotten what he was. But for those who had survived, the story did not end. Their scars, both seen and unseen, would follow them forever. What investigators found in that basement defied even their worst expectations. The air was thick, tainted with rot and decay. The walls bore the desperate scratches of hands clawing at cement, a silent testament to lost battles and shattered hopes. Rusted chains still hung from the floor, relics of the torment endured by those who had once been trapped there. Beyond the horrors of the basement, authorities uncovered a meticulously kept archive of Jacob R. Miller's depravity. Handwritten records, disturbing photographs, and propaganda materials revealed the full extent of his ideology and his deep entrenchment within the Iron Dawn Alliance. Every abduction, every act of cruelty, every twisted experiment had been documented with chilling precision. He had treated his crimes not as moments of violence, but as calculated steps toward an unspeakable goal. The trial of Jacob R. Miller in 2012 was one of the most harrowing in state history. The courtroom was packed, journalists, activists, and members of a community still reeling from the revelation of what had been happening in their midst. The 5 survivors took the stand, their testimonies raw and unfiltered. Sam described the suffocating darkness, the starvation, the sound of chains clinking in the silence. Ava spoke of Lily's slow death, how they had whispered to her as she faded, powerless to save her. Rachel, Jacob's niece, testified with a trembling voice, recounting how he had molded her since childhood, feeding her poison disguised as ideology. Jacob sat through it all, expressionless. He did not flinch at the details of his own brutality. He showed no remorse, no fear, no shame. But when the guilty verdict was read, on all counts, something flickered in his eyes. Not regret, not sorrow, just the quiet, dawning realization that he would never control anything again. He was sentenced to life without parole. But for the survivors, his sentencing was not the end. The aftermath was another kind of battle. The first weeks after their escape were a haze of hospital rooms, therapy sessions, and police interrogations. Sam, her knuckles still raw from attacking Jacob, refused to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that basement. Ava clung to her newborn with a desperation that alarmed the doctors. Emily withdrew, barely speaking, and Rachel, trapped between guilt and rage, couldn't stop wondering how she had been so blind. The town of Ashland, once convinced of Jacob's kindness, was left shattered. Some neighbors wept, unable to reconcile the man they knew with the monster he was. Others burned with guilt, asking themselves the same question over and over. How had they never seen it? How had they never known? In the years that followed, the survivors refused to let their suffering be the only story told. Sam and Ava became relentless advocates, speaking about human trafficking and the hidden dangers of extremist groups. Rachel worked with law enforcement to dismantle other hate networks, turning her past into a weapon against the ideology that had nearly consumed her. And in Lily Harper's name, they founded the Lily Foundation, a refuge for those who had survived the unthinkable. Jacob R. Miller's story became a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of how evil does not always come with a snarling face or a violent outburst. Sometimes it wears a polite smile. Sometimes it waves from the front porch. Sometimes it sits quietly in the back pew of a church, nodding along to the sermon. And sometimes no one sees it, until it is too late. The past never truly faded. For the 5 survivors, life after the basement was not salvation. It was another kind of prison. The world had moved on, but they were trapped in time, their bodies free while their minds remained chained beneath the earth, where the air was thick with rot and the screams had never really stopped. Some nights they woke up gasping, fingers clawing at phantom shackles. The scent of damp concrete, the hum of a basement light, the creak of an old door. Ordinary things became portals, dragging them back to the nightmare they had barely escaped. But survival was not the same as living. Samantha Baker carried her rage like a weapon. She refused to be another broken girl in a forgotten case file. She hunted the monsters lurking in the shadows, learned their methods, memorized the way they selected their victims. She worked with law enforcement, tracking the traffickers, the kidnappers, the ones who thought they would never be caught. Her name became known in dark circles, an avenger with nothing left to lose. Yet the more she fought, the more she felt like she was chasing ghosts, a whisper of her past self, unable to escape the thing she had become. Ava had chosen a different war. She raised Lily's child as if love alone could erase the past, as if she could protect the girl from the horrors that had created her. She shielded her from the truth, whispering bedtime stories instead of nightmares. But in Ava's quietest moments, she wondered if blood carried memory, if the echoes of that basement would pass through generations like an unspoken curse. Sometimes in the dead of night, Ava would wake with her chest tight, the phantom weight of the basement pressing down on her. The darkness would claw at her, making the past feel as if it had never let go. But then she would glance over at the little girl, sleeping soundly beside her, and the nightmare would fade, at least for a moment. the pain never fully left. But in her work at the foundation, helping women survivors rebuild their lives, she found something greater than herself. It gave her purpose. It kept the darkness at bay, if only for a while. Emily saw the world for what it was, a system of predators and prey. She had learned to read people in captivity, to recognize the small shifts in body language that signaled fear, submission, defiance. Now she used that knowledge to infiltrate the digital underground, hunting the same kind of men who had destroyed them. She analyzed patterns, decrypted conversations on the dark web, tore apart exploitation networks before they could claim another girl. But each click of the keyboard felt like a heartbeat in the dark, a pulse of something vile just beneath the surface, something that could never be fully erased. Rachel lived with the weight of betrayal. Her uncle had smiled at her, taught her how to ride a bike, patted her head like she was something worth keeping. And all the while he had been a monster. She had believed in him. That knowledge festered inside her, a wound that would never close. So she made it her mission to hunt others like him, extremists who used charm as a mask, who built their empires in the blind spots of society. She had spent years trapped in the illusion of a loving family. Now she made sure no one else fell for the same lie. Time moved forward, but the past did not release them. Jacob R. Miller's name faded into history, not as the architect of a new world, but as a failed man whose victims had risen against him. He was not remembered, but they were, not as survivors, as something else, something stronger. The four of them gathered in silence, the weight of the date pressing heavily between them. There was no need to speak. They all understood the significance without a word. Some years they lit a candle for Lily, a quiet tribute to the girl they had lost. Other times they simply sat together, sharing a glass of wine or a cup of coffee, each of them silently grappling with the memories that never fully faded. In their company, the words were unnecessary. Their bond was something unspoken, something that transcended the pain. One day, they each carried their pain differently, their burdens hidden behind their eyes. But together they had built something far stronger than any of them had expected. What had once been a tragedy had become a monument to resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of humanity, light could still break through. The years passed, the scars deepening, but their bond never wavered. Despite the chaos of their separate lives, they always found time to reunite. No matter how much time had passed or how much they had grown, they still looked into each other's eyes and remembered everything they had survived together. The pain remained lingering like a distant echo, but it no longer defined them. They were no longer victims. They were more than survivors. They had become warriors who had turned their worst nightmare into a reason to fight. Sam continued her relentless crusade, her voice carrying the weight of her suffering, now transformed into a beacon of hope for other victims. Her name appeared in police reports, in rescue programs, and in law reforms aimed at preventing the horrors they had endured. She became an unwavering symbol in the battle against human trafficking and gender violence. The rage that once threatened to consume her was no longer her enemy. She had learned to channel it into something good. Ava watched Lily's daughter grow, her pride immeasurable. The girl blossomed into a young woman, full of life with the same kindness and strength that her mother had possessed. She wasn't shielded from the truth of her origins, but she was never defined by them. As she grew older, she came to understand that she was born not just from pain, but from resilience, and that her existence was a testament to her mother's victory over the darkness that had once sought to consume her. Emily remained entrenched in the underground network, never ceasing her work. She hunted the predators who thought they operated unseen, tracking their every move, exposing their dark dealings, and rescuing victims before they were lost forever. She became a quiet but formidable force, feared by those who lived in the shadows. Fame had never been her goal, but she knew that each life she saved, each criminal network she dismantled, gave her suffering purpose. It had all led to this. Rachel threw herself into preventing radicalization, using her own tragic past as a warning. She worked tirelessly, pulling young people away from the lure of extremist ideologies, teaching them how hate could mask itself under the guise of ideology. Every life she saved, every person she steered away from that path, was a step closer to healing the wound that Jacob had left in her. Time marched on, and though the sharpest pangs of pain had dulled, the scars were still there, a permanent reminder of what they had endured. They had rebuilt their lives, but they would never forget what had nearly destroyed them. The nightmares still came, quiet whispers in the night, memories that clawed at their consciousness. But now, when they woke, they knew they were safe. The worst was behind them. They had survived, not by forgetting, but by transforming their suffering into something that would never stop burning bright, even in the darkest moments.